I was sent a link by one of my subscribers asking what I think about this rabbi's arguments in regards to atheists. He's passionate about his faith, I'll give him that. A lot of his arguments are repeated, and he goes off on some other points like Talmudic law, who can have what position in the temples, or Jewish history, all fascinating topics, and I learned a lot from them. I didn't know that Jewish faith incorporated reincarnation, or that they founded Hinduism, but were unimportant to the topic at hand, so I edited for brevity's sake. If you're interested, you can watch the whole thing. It's not my usual fare. These are his thoughts on the arguments atheists use, and my thoughts on his thoughts. Anyway, let me know what you think, what I got wrong and all that.
If you are claiming that something's true about the world, then others have the right to ask you, why are you claiming that? What makes you think so? What reasons do you have for your position? If you have no reasons for your position, then you expose yourself as a kind of not serious person. It makes no difference whether you're arguing that God exists or God doesn't exist.
Yes, but I'm not claiming existence or non-existence of God. I'm claiming the lack of evidence of one's existence. The reason I have for that position is that no evidence has been presented to me. And if you lack evidence for something, there's no rational reason to say it exists.
Let's take it in ordinary examples of life where we talk about existence and non-existence. Let's talk about a viral infection. One person says he has an infection, one person says he does not. Would we follow the following path? Well, let's see. The one who says he's infected says there are viruses in his blood. That's a claim of existence. The one who says he's healthy says there are not viruses in his blood. That's a claim of non-existence. So non-existence wins by default, unless and until you have convincing evidence that there are viruses there. Would anybody do that? Of course not. Being healthy and being sick are equally claims that have to be defended. If you haven't checked his blood, there's no default position. Surely he's healthy because we haven't checked his blood. That's ridiculous. If you haven't checked his blood, the right position is, I don't know whether he's healthy or not. That's the right position. The symptoms of Ebola don't show till after a week. This person's been in the area and he's left there 3 days ago. Is he infected or isn't he? Would anybody say, well, we have no evidence, so for sure he's clean?
This is a false equivalence. For your argument, then yes, you can't default to a person being healthy. But you're not claiming that Ebola does or doesn't exist. You're arguing if a person is infected or not. Remember, we have evidence of things that we know about diseases like Ebola. We know it exists. We know it can be passed on. We know that symptoms may or may not appear for 2 to 21 days after infection. We know how infection works. We know, in your example, that this theoretical person has been in an area where he could have caught it recently. We can use these as evidence that it's possible someone may be sick and not showing symptoms yet. We don't say for sure there's no God, simply there's no reason to believe in one. There is evidence that diseases like Ebola exist, so saying that you may have it is not an extraordinary claim that you could have it over someone saying they don't. It is extraordinary to claim that God exists, since there's no evidence, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I have a feeling I'll be using this a lot today.
That would be ridiculous. We would say, we haven't checked his blood, so we don't know. Let's check his blood and find out.
Have you been checked recently for canosyphilades? That's as if cancer and syphilis had a baby that caught full-blown AIDS. Yeah, it's stupid, but it's a guilty pleasure. Hey! Oh, accurate. Anyway, of course you haven't, because there's no evidence that such a disease exists. But by your logic, you could have it right now, so you should check. And that's not even as extraordinary a claim as God, because we have evidence that other diseases exist. So, why aren't you getting tested for every real and imaginary disease out there? And then, once all those tests are done, you get checked all over again because you may have caught them in the meantime? Because you would only check for things you have evidence that you may have caught. In the same way, I only believe in things I have evidence for.
So, a believer owes an argument that God exists. An atheist owes an argument that God doesn't exist. If we have neither, then we are agnostics, and we say we don't know whether God exists or not.
That's not exactly true. As an atheist, I don't claim that God doesn't exist, but the argument is I have no evidence for God or gods, so I have no reason to believe in one. That's all I am claiming. I have no reason to believe in a God. Just to get terms correct, an agnostic has no knowledge that gods exist. An atheist has no belief in them. A theist believes in a god or gods, and an anti-theist makes the claim they don't exist. I'm the first two. I have no knowledge, and so I don't have any belief. When I say there's no God, I mean it in the same way that I mean there are no leprechauns. No reasonable evidence has been given for their existence. I do not presuppose they exist, so I have no reason to believe in them. If new evidence comes to light, I will have to, and am willing to change my mind.
Somebody's trying to support his position. He puts forth his evidence, puts forth his arguments, and it's really not going too well, and there are weaknesses and certain counterexamples he didn't consider, and there are certain problems with the logic, and when he gets desperate, he says to the other guy, okay, show me wrong. That's a foul. That's a foul.
Yes, let's remember that. According to his logic, when someone makes a claim, saying, show me wrong is apparently a foul. I personally don't 100% agree with that. I say there's no evidence. If I'm wrong, I want to be shown.
That wasn't in the discussion. To defeat your certainty that you're right, we don't have to show you wrong. All we have to show is that you haven't got enough evidence to convince us that you're right. That's much easier than showing he's wrong. It's a false defense to say, I'm going to hold my position until you prove me wrong. It's illogical. If I can't support my claim that I'm right, then I ought to give up my claim. I ought to say, I don't know whether I'm right or not. That would be the honest thing to do. If I say to you, prove I'm wrong, I'm throwing up a smoke screen as if to make me give up my certainty that I'm right, you have to prove me wrong. That's incorrect. You don't have to prove me wrong. You have to do something much easier. Just show that my reasons are not good reasons. And by the way, in an American court of law, you have this in spades. A person is accused of a crime. What's the job of the prosecutor?
To prove him guilty.
Say again?
To prove him guilty.
To prove him guilty. Prove in American law means
Without doubt.
beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt. There could be a doubt, or we wouldn't call it a reasonable doubt. What's the job of the defense attorney?
Create a reasonable doubt.
To cast any doubt.
To create a reasonable doubt. That's all. The defense attorney does not have to show that he's innocent. That's not his job. Just to create a reasonable doubt. If the defense attorney wins, at the end of the trial, usually, we don't know whether he's guilty or not.
And this is why legal trials should not be used to prove scientific facts of the world, and something existing is a scientific claim. Legal trials are good for working out justice because they are, theoretically, weighted on the side of the defense. In a scientific area, people should be interested in the truth. As you said, in a court of law, the defense attorney is not interested in the truth. They just want to confuse things enough to get their way. I am interested in the truth, not just saying I'm right. If it turns out there really is a single monotheistic God, and even if I'm not one of the chosen people, I still would like to know the truth.
So, my recommendation is, if a person comes across and says, I'm an atheist, because I know there is no God, put the burden of proof on him and say, okay, please show me your argument, your reason, your evidence that there is no God.
First, again, the argument is there is no evidence for God, so I have no reason to believe in one. Second, you cannot prove a negative. Otherwise, you can claim anything exists, and then say the burden of evidence is on the one who says it doesn't exist. An argument that can say anything exists, so we should believe in it, is futile because it doesn't give any useful information about the world. It's as if I was to claim there's a fire-breathing dragon living in my garage that just can't be detected, but you should believe it's there anyway.
Having read the literature, almost all of it is, I can show you what's wrong with all the arguments for God. That's totally irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. That's just a smokescreen. That's just passing the buck. You're telling me there is no God. What are your positive arguments that there is no God?
The point is, if all the arguments for God are wrong, then there are no arguments for God. And if there are no arguments, and no evidence that something exists, there is no reason to believe it exists. He then moves to the argument from evil that some atheists use. I honestly don't think that's a good argument for atheism, and I've said so before, but let's see where he goes.
The argument from evil is an attempt to do the job. There's so much evil in the world, there couldn't be a God who knows everything and who has the power to run the world and is morally perfect. Okay? That's an argument. Point out that some evil is deserved, let's say as a response to crime. An evil that's deserved isn't a problem. It wouldn't affect God's moral perfection if a person committed a crime and God punished him for so doing, and the punishment fit the crime, was commensurate with the crime.
Yes, but that doesn't explain why God allowed the crime in the first place. It simply says you get harmed to balance out something you did.
They had it coming.
But if God is all-powerful and knows what's going to happen and is all good, then why was the crime allowed to happen in the first place? And not all crimes get punished. Some people get away with crime and live good lives after, or at least better than they deserve. If evil happening in the world is punishment, then why would God be haphazard in doling out punishments? Some evil in the world gets punished, and some doesn't?
And some evil serves good future purpose. It's an investment in a future gain. No one complains about the loss of his capital when he invests it and earns 10% a year. And in the meantime, he can't use it for barbecues and trips to Ceylon.
The problem with this is, God is supposed to be all-powerful, so he would not need any kind of, as you put it, investment. He could make any good future purpose he wanted happen without any harm or evil befalling anybody. If he was omnipotent and omniscient, then he would have the power and the knowledge to get whatever he wanted in a way that would not cause harm to anybody. If my kid got an infection in his finger, and I didn't want it to spread, I would give him antibodies to treat it, not cut the whole hand off. They both have the same good outcome, preventing the infection from spreading, but one causes harm and the other doesn't. Wouldn't a good God, with infinite power, want to prevent harm when attempting to get what it wants?
And it can be argued that suffering that's deserved by crime on the one hand, and suffering that's an investment in the future good on the other hand, covers the whole ground. Covers the whole ground. There isn't anything left over. Or better, to put the point slightly more sharply, in terms of what I've told you up until now, it can be argued that the critic can't show that it doesn't cover the whole ground.
Huh. That's a prove me wrong statement, which I believe you said was a foul.
Okay, show me wrong. That's a foul. To press the problem of evil, he's got to show there's evil that can't be justified. Can't be justified. When you take into account the extent of human failure, and you take into account the way in which suffering can improve a person and create good for him, it's impossible to show there's any leftover human suffering that hasn't been taken account of. And that being the case, the problem of evil can't be pressed conclusively against the existence of God. That's a standard way to respond to the problem of evil. Yeah.
Okay, just to be sure I understand your position, your argument against the problem of evil is, people either deserve what evil befalls them, or it serves some kind of investment for greater good. Have I got that right? You're saying that a natural disaster like the Boxing Day tsunami, or a human-caused evil like the Holocaust can be justified, and that's the word you used, justified, because either the victims deserved it, or it was an investment that will pay off later and should be excused for not being stopped. That's what I got from your argument. Please remember that. It'll come up later.
Okay, that's the problem from evil.
I'm going to give you, and anyone watching, some help when dealing with an atheist who brings up the problem of evil. 8 simple words. Why does the atheist say God is good? We don't just disbelieve in the Abrahamic God, but of all gods. If you want to shoot someone down who's using the argument from evil, simply posit a God that is not good, either evil at worst, or even just benign and uncaring. That will stop the argument from evil in its tracks. The argument from evil does not disprove the idea of God. It disproves the idea of a God with certain characteristics, but still leaves the door open for other intelligent creator beings. That's why I don't think it's a good argument for atheists to use.
Now, there's another type of problem, which is, and gets a similar explanation, and that is when the laws that God lays down seem to be unjust laws. Unjust, morally questionable laws. About this, there's a lot of complaint in atheistic sources. The connection to atheism is, assuming that God is morally perfect, then at the very least, he couldn't be the author of these laws because these laws are not moral.
Again, the problem isn't that religious laws are unjust. A God can make up any laws he wants to. If a God felt like it, he could make up a law where you have to sacrifice your firstborn, in a long, torturous, drawn-out way, just because this God thought it would be funny. He's God. He can make up whatever rules he wants. They don't have to be nice. Our question is, how do we know these laws come from a God at all? Whether these laws are just or not, there is no evidence that it comes from an intelligent creator of any kind. So, he goes on and says that we can't know if laws are moral or not, because we don't know what the effects of them would be.
Okay, now, what are we supposed to think of laws that we regard as immoral? Well, presumably they're immoral because they have bad effects, or maybe unjust effects, or whatever. But then, maybe we don't know what the effects are. Maybe we don't know what the effects are. we don't know what the effects are, maybe we're not equipped to determine that it's really immoral. Maybe this law that requires us to do something in a certain case, in those circumstances, preventing something much worse. Only we don't know that. After all, we're not running the world, and the world doesn't develop in haphazard terms. It doesn't develop in accidental terms, in random terms. We believe in divine providence, which means that when you act on a divine law, that fits into a structure of divine providence for running the world. The standard example, which secular philosophers give, imagine you knew that that baby was going to grow up to be Hitler. Would you strangle it in its crib? Well, most people wouldn't hesitate. Unless you're a believer in historical determinism, that the person has nothing to do with the development of history, and it's the times and somebody else will step into the role. That's a myth that's common in some quarters. But if you don't believe that, if you believe you could stop the tragedy of the Second World War, in which 65 million people died, including 6 million Jews, you thought you could stop that by strangling one baby. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have any hesitation in strangling one baby.
Okay, now I'm going to go back to the earlier point regarding evil. You said that
when you take into account the extent of human failure, and you take into account the way in which suffering can improve a person and create good for him, it's impossible to show there's any leftover human suffering that hasn't been taken account of.
So, if that was the case, why would you kill Hitler? From your point of view, God didn't stop the Holocaust. So, by your reasoning, either those killed in the concentration camps deserved it. Ugh, I feel dirty for even saying that. Or it was for a greater good, which is apparently worth the millions of deaths. I don't believe that, but according to your earlier comment, you obviously do. I think I would do what I could to stop it, but then again, I don't have a reason to justify the evil in the world like you seem to do. I would cease to exist, since my grandparents met because of the war. But, paradoxes aside, my existence is outweighed by the millions saved. But, if you believe your argument from before, then you mean you believe you're preventing something that God wanted to happen. So who are you to say you are smarter than your God?
Other thing that people try to press is historical and archaeological arguments against statements that are in the Torah, other places in the Tanakh, about historical events that the Torah has described, and they want to claim that they are incorrect. I'll say a few words about that, and then I'll have some time for questions. If there are any questions, then we can quit. What do you think of the following methodology? We are going to test whether or not the Torah's view of history is true. We don't want to be biased, so we're going to put a question mark on the Torah. Is it true or isn't it true? Then we're going to use other sources of ancient history and see if the Torah agrees with them, then we have confirmation that it's true. If the Torah disagrees with them, then we have evidence that the Torah is false. That's an unbiased, fair, objective method. I don't think so. Because if the Torah disagrees with some other text of ancient history, maybe the other text is wrong.
The problem with that is religious documents, including the Torah, make unsubstantiated claims that go against what we know about the physical properties of the universe. Let's see how he deals with that.
Here's the example, an example, the flood. All the secular critics want to know, where's the worldwide mud layer that's the result of a flood? There isn't a worldwide mud layer. So then the story of the flood isn't true. You see his logic? The Torah describes it as a miracle. He says there are no miracles. So if the text is talking about a real event, it's got to be a natural event. If it's a natural event, natural floods leave behind mud layers. If there's no mud layers, so there's no natural event. So the text is wrong. But of course, the correct approach is the Torah was talking about a miracle. You have no reason to think that miraculous floods leave behind mud layers. How many miraculous floods have you studied after all? How many have you cataloged? 0. We don't predict that there'll be a mud layer. So the missing mud layer is no evidence against us. It's only evidence against your fantasy of a natural flood. It's irrelevant to us. You'll tell me that makes it hard to check? Too bad. Too bad. Being hard to check is no argument that it didn't happen.
This is another prove me wrong type statement, which, as mentioned before, I believe you said was a foul. The Torah has made claims, in this case, that there was a flood. The miracle is that it was able to rain enough to cover the entire world. You are claiming that an event happened, and that since afterwards there is no evidence that it happened, we should assume it did? We don't just want to know about the missing mud layer, but the missing anything that could show your claim occurred. Why is there no evidence anywhere that these events happened? In fact, why is there evidence that it didn't? For example, there are continuous Chinese records that don't mention anything about a flood during an event that was supposed to flood and drown out the entire world. Or the organisms that could not have traveled from Mount Ararat to distant and inaccessible areas of the world 4,000 years ago.
See how clever this part is? How it doesn't require a shred of proof? And most paranoid delusions are intricate, but this is brilliant.
If you expect us to believe something happened, you need to provide evidence. The default state of being for any claim of existence is there is no reason to assume something exists until evidence can be presented. Say you want to claim that a historical person existed. Well, we know people exist, so that's a start. Or an event like a war. We know those are possible, and they happened at other points in history. So, saying a person existed or a war happened are not extraordinary claims. If you want to claim that people or events occurred with supernatural powers or actions that go against our knowledge of the world, then you'll need extraordinary evidence to back it up. Otherwise, there is no reason to believe. Claims that cannot be tested are worthless. You want to claim that a seaworthy boat was built large enough to hold breeding stock for every animal, and it was used to survive and repopulate the world after a flood drowned everything. Those things both go against what we know about the world and have left no evidence, so there's absolutely no reason to believe they occurred. Our knowledge of the world could be wrong, I admit that, and history may have happened as the Torah described. But until there's any kind of evidence for this, or of any miracles, the intellectually honest thing to do is not believe it happened, like all extraordinary, unsubstantiated claims. Rabbi, I can respect your position, but you often seem to fall back on the show me wrong argument that you yourself would be a foul. If you, or anyone of any religion, wants claims to be accepted, then evidence is needed. Otherwise, the only logical fallback would be a lack of belief in what you are claiming. Which, by the way, is not the same as a belief in the lack of what is being claimed. I can appreciate your devotion to your beliefs, and if you want to keep believing, no one can take that away from you. But, if you want to convince an atheist of anything, just one piece of evidence to back up your claims of an omnipotent creator being would be a start.